Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of 10,000 Heroes. I'm your host, Ankur Shah Delight. This is episode 102 of the 10,000 Heroes Show. Welcome back to the club. These days I'm calling it the 10,000 Heroes Club, and it reminds me of this band that I helped start years ago called This Is Our First Time. And the main principle of the band was if you show up to band practice, which was every week, you're in the band. And if you don't, you're kicked out of the band. And that's ruthlessly kicked out of the band until the next time you show up, which is when you're once again admitted into the band. So if you're listening right now, you're in the club. Congratulations. And if you're not, you're kicked out. Out of the club. Out of the club. And I really see what we're doing here as a community. In my mind, I call it a community of purpose. So we're all here focused on purpose, living our purpose in a better way, understanding more about purpose, and supporting each other. And I really don't think we're going to make it through this little crucible that the humans have created for ourselves without mutual support. We need everybody to be living their best and contributing, really aligned with our highest values in order to get through this little game that we've set up, this game of near destruction we've set up for ourselves. So that's the fun part of being in community. And the other part is, of course, everybody knows how hard it is to go through it alone. And it's just, honestly, it's a terrible idea. And so feeling supported, supporting each other is the way. And part of that is the essential inherent paradox of focusing on purpose. Because if you believe in this notion, or you understand this notion of purpose, you can't not be living your purpose. If you believe you have one, it's unavoidable. It's just part of who you are. You know, in the Bhagavad Gita, they call it Swadharma. It's like Swadharma it is the Dharma for you individually. In Momentum Lab, we call it thumbprint, specific purpose. That we're all here to do it and we can't escape it, and it's different for every single one of us. So then it's effortless. It's part of it. But the other half of the paradox is that without a lot of intention and effort and awareness, we can so easily slip away into just garbage and wasting our time watching circuses on TV. So that's the paradox. It's effortlessly in us, and yet it requires attention every day to not get sucked into somebody else's critique or somebody else's perspective, or what the guy on Fox News wants you to do, or your aunt or your ex-girlfriend, or even those other elements in yourself that just want weed and fast cars and whatever it is. But you know that there's actually something you're here to do. You may not know what it is. And that little hint, sometimes I see it as a burden, is what draws me forward, and I feel like what maybe unites us and draws us all forward to keep striving with a little bit of work and a little bit of effortlessness and inhabiting and writing the paradox. So that was a little bit of a preface, I guess. So today's episode is this interview I did with George Moore, who is he's a psychologist by trade, but that's really totally unimportant and almost never comes up in this interview. He is currently surviving with AIDS and has been doing so for 40 years. And it's been really an incredible story of how many times he's almost died and what he's learned from those experiences. And as I was editing it just now, there were just so many. I'm going to make shorts, like YouTube shorts, for the first time, because he has so many moments that are just like, God, everybody just needs to hear this. And so George is a mystic. That's how I see it. And I love mystics because they make no sense. And here I am like, oh, I'm all about math and rationality and computer science. And I just love it when people talk like that. It's not like it's making anti-sense. He's not breaking any rules, but it's just on this other level that is beyond the domain of what I normally apply rationality to. And it just fills me up. So when you listen to this and you hear that George believes in some wacky shit, I invite you to ask yourself, to what end does he believe in wacky shit? And to what end do I believe in wacky shit? And does it support the goal of unconditional love? And that's what I get from George, is that every experience he's had, and every interpretation he's created to put over it is just optimized for unconditional love.
I just am a long-term survivor of AIDS. I found that news out that I was HIV positive in 1989 when I was 23 years old. And there were really, the only people I knew died in like 6 months. So I really didn't think I had long to live.
It helped bring me back and bring the listener back. In 1989, what was known about AIDS? What were the connotations of having HIV?
Well, probably back up even a little further. In 1984, I graduated from high school, right? And my senior year of high school, I came out as a gay man, which was pretty rare in those days for somebody in high school. But
And
I've
where
been
was that, George?
in Phoenix, New York, a little town north of Syracuse. Yeah, I discovered that I was gay my senior year and started acting on that knowledge, seeing men, and actually got sick that summer after I graduated. My mom called this doctor to see what was going on, and she overheard him in the background saying to the nurse, like, I don't know what's going on with that guy, but I don't want him coming in here and infecting my other patients. And in 1984, there was no HIV test. So I went to Cornell my freshman year thinking really like I was going to be dead within months. So it was really a crazy time.
And was this just, what kind of sickness was this? Was it just like because you had a sickness that was unexplained and you were just like,
Yeah,
oh, this must be HIV?
fever, diarrhea, that kind of stuff. And there was no test. The test hadn't been invented yet, so they couldn't test and find out what was wrong with me. But I did recover from that. It was just kind of a virus, I believe, because I then was tested, and tested negative once the test came out, which was within a year of that event. But then fast forward to 1989, and I do end up becoming HIV positive. There were safe sex practices, but they definitely weren't 100% foolproof, as I found out. So that's sort of when things really started for me in terms of just thinking, oh, this is the end now, because still there weren't any effective medications. And I ended up going to New York City about a year after I tested positive, because there were organizations there like the Body Positive that were really working to help people learn how to live with this illness. And so I started to get hopeful that maybe I could survive for a while anyway. And so a couple of years into working with the Body Positive, I thought, well, we'll see what happens, right? I started to have some hope. And I returned to school at Cornell and got the first blood test where my T cells had dipped below this magic number of 200, which, defined the difference between being HIV positive and being a person with AIDS, because below 200, you're just suddenly, just at risk for all these opportunistic infections. And that was a pretty hard bit of news to get. But I kept going to school. I mean, here I am, nothing really has changed other than this number. Psychologically, it was a lot to get through, but nothing changed in how I was feeling. So I just kept the Body Positive sort of thing, taking my vitamins, meditating, different things that really just to help try to cope with the emotional and psychological toll of carrying the diagnosis. And
nothing to do with the physical feeling of unwellness. I mean, I guess in addition to that, there's this added layer of the emotional toll and the psychological, just like, oh, great, now my days are numbered. Now I'm among the doomed or the marked.
And physically, I was doing really well by then. I was, taking vitamins. I was trying to eat pretty well, and trying to take care of my psychological health with meditation, and it was just a number. So that's what I kept telling myself. And so I graduated from Cornell in 93, and I went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison for a PhD program in environmental sociology. And right after I arrived, I ended up getting a sinus infection, right? Like anybody else. So I go to see the doctor on campus, and he has no familiarity with HIV/AIDS, and he just freaks out that I have a sinus infection, and he just prescribes me the most heavy duty antibiotic. And this is where I often start my story with the joke of I once had diarrhea for 3.5 years, because it's true. And this is when it started, from this doctor who just really overreacted, and rather than calling a specialist and saying, what do you do with somebody who has 195 T cell count and has a sinus infection, he just decided my immune system was compromised, so he should use the heaviest antibiotics available to him. wiped out my digestive tract. And that really started, that's when I started to really go downhill pretty quickly, because when everything you eat just passes through you, you end up losing weight fast. My immune system markers started diving. And within 6 months of arriving in Madison, I was not in the graduate program anymore. I spent most of my days doubled over in pain. I sort of had the choice of either being in excruciating pain, sort of curled up in a fetal position, trying to manage the pain, which was like digesting glass shards all the time. It felt like I just had glass shards in my intestines. And I could be that, or I could take opium, a liquid opium tincture, and sleep, but not be in pain. So it's a pretty hard time, and quickly, my roommates and things started being a little bit afraid to, take me any place, because they were afraid I was going to die. I sort of knew every clean public bathroom in the city of Madison, Wisconsin, because I might have to, I would maybe have to use the restroom 12, 13 times in a day. So I couldn't travel very far. But during this time, when I was getting really ill and really sick, this incredible thing happened in Janesville, Wisconsin. This is around 94 now. This white buffalo calf miracle was born that summer. And at Cornell, as well as being a rural sociologist, I had studied a lot of American Indian studies. And Cornell doesn't offer minors, but I would have had a minor in American Indian studies had the school offered them. And so I knew that for the Lakota, the birth of a white buffalo calf was a harbinger of peace. And I was like so angry about leaving my graduate program and just being a 27 or so year old man with having to give up graduate school, and is going to a support group for people with AIDS. And we had 1 or 2 memorial services every month because there were no effective treatments. And so I had a lot of anger. I had a lot of judgment of what I was going through. And it was just really hard. It was just really, really hard. So this white buffalo calf is born, and I'm like, oh man, I can really use some peace, right? Like I need to have some peace. So I spent a couple of weeks talking one of my roommates into driving me to see this white buffalo calf, which was in Janesville, Wisconsin. So it's maybe an hour, a little more than an hour away. And they're like, I don't know. And I'm like, I have to do this. Like, so they finally agreed to take me.
Okay, George, I need to stop you for a second, just so I can understand. How did you grow up, like religiously or culturally? Like what kind of information or baggage are you bringing to the table? Because I'm kind of surprised that this like PhD, person who's going to do an environmental sociology program is like finds the white buffalo calf to be a really moving symbol and wants to move and see it. So like, how did that?
Yeah, wow. That's a huge question, I think, in so many ways. I was raised Catholic. I'm the youngest of 6 children. My mother was Catholic, so she raised us Catholic. My father, Methodist, didn't go to church with us, but we went to church every Sunday. Her mother claimed to be Native American. She was born on Aguasasni, a Mohawk reservation, and believed herself to be Mohawk. Genetic testing has revealed that this was a family myth, but only recently.
But was she culturally Mohawk? Did she?
So she did. She did. Like she was a fisherwoman. She was a strong woman. She used herbs for healing. She had a lot of that knowledge from being raised in that environment. Her parents both died in the influenza pandemic way back. And so that's part of why I was always drawn to that. Plus, I just was a kind of a weird spiritual little kid. Like I really feared for my father's soul because he didn't go to church with us, when I was probably in first grade, I would get up early in the morning before anyone in my family because, when you're the youngest of six, there's not a lot of space for you. And so getting up early is quiet, like you could sit in a chair. And I would turn on Oral Roberts, like as a kid. And so when I was in like first grade, I wrote to him for a Bible because we didn't have a Bible in our house. And I would talk to angels and, all these things, which I never talked about. It's so funny how quickly we are conditioned to only talk about things that other people seem to be talking about, right? Like, I didn't say anything about my feelings towards boys, which were there from as early as I can remember. Maybe first grade was my first crush on a third grade boy. Didn't talk about that. Didn't talk about the angels.
So no one had to tell you that angels weren't real. You just knew not to talk about them.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm open, I would say, spiritually, have always been open, even though I had some cultural conditioning as a Catholic. I always had other influences. During my confirmation process in Catholicism, when you're in your early teens, you confirm as a Catholic. It's one of the rites of passage. And I was very struggling with the triune nature of the Catholic God. I'm like, how can that, possibly be, right? Like, it was really just mystifying to me. It was really hard for me to buy, so, but I'm a pretty compliant person. So I'm dutifully praying about this as I'm told about whether or not to, confirm. And this is a big part of it, is accepting the triune nature of God. So it's like winter time and I'm out in my snowsuit. Central New York, it's about 120 inches of snow a year. So it's a pretty snowy place. I'm out in my snowsuit, like lying in a snowbank, praying and deep into prayer. And at some point, and I'm like, I don't know. I know I'm not supposed to ask for signs, but I'm just having a hard time with this 3-in-1 business, I need something. And I open my eyes and there are like 3 white birds circling above me, right? Probably seagulls or something, I don't know. But, the white dove is a symbol of the Holy Spirit for Catholics. So I was like, okay, all right, I'm going to go through with my confirmation, right? So I had
seagulls, doves, 3,
whatever, right? Right. So that's it. So that's those kind of things would happen to me.
Okay.
So
one more little question, and then I'll let us get back to the buffalo. But so with the Catholic upbringing, you coming out as homosexual in high school, any kind of
it was bad. So it's always like, what do you include from your story, right? So when I came out in high school, I've discovered I was gay just about a week before my 18th birthday, when I found myself making out with a man, and I was like, oh, this is what's been this has been like this thing that I've been noticing and pushing down and noticing it. There's sort of the elephant in the room for me for a long time without acknowledging it. And I kept it to myself for all of 5 weeks. And then on the first day of spring, March 21st, 1984, I told my best friend, who I'd known since kindergarten, Kate. And Kate says, when I tell her, like, it takes me all this, guts to tell her, I say, I'm gay. And she's like, I've always known that.
Yeah.
She had a gay uncle. And I'm like, well, why didn't you tell me? And she's like, George, there's just some things you have to discover for yourself. And I'm like, well, ain't that the truth, right? Like, who's going to want to hear that from anybody else, right? So then in my graduation, I tried to tell my mom, I tried to say, like, I'm going to invite some gay people to my graduation party, thinking she would ask me about that, right? Like, that's a pretty weird thing for an 18-year-old boy to say. She doesn't ask me about it. I don't know how to tell her, I'm just a 18-year-old stumbling around through life. And so I wear some gay pride buttons to my graduation. And then several of the men that I was dating showed up at my graduation party because my mom said, yeah, you can invite who you want. It's your graduation party. And one of them was sort of this kind of alpha male. He was like 6'2", black belt in karate, just big, kind of beautiful Italian man. And he just decided he would let everybody know in his mind that I was his property or something. He just became very assertive. So I kind of came out to my whole family, my whole neighborhood, my cousins.
Everyone at this party.
All in one fell swoop without wanting to or without really meaning to. It was clear. So the day after that, my mom, who's really one of the nicest people like I've ever met, like if we ever said anything bad about anyone growing up, her response would be, well, you don't know what it's like to walk in their shoes. She had a pretty hard childhood. And so she was very sensitive to others. But my mom looked at me and said, it's like you're dead to me.
Ooh.
And it was one of the single most devastating moments of my life, but also one of the most important, right? Because I come from this really tight-knit family. And sometimes my siblings are like, I don't get your relationship with mom, like how you just say, no, I'm only going to call you once a week and these things. And I'm like, well, I had a different experience of our mother than anyone else. So I started to have to set those boundaries, right? But I actually left my house the next day and ended up moving in with the Italian man who was quite abusive and brought home some sexually transmitted diseases, and which is why I thought another reason why I thought it was HIV positive, because I went through this other experience between graduating from high school and going to Cornell. Yeah, pretty hard time, but also again really important because it really forced me to differentiate and to really find within myself a way of being okay in the world even when the world isn't okay, right? So I wouldn't wish that experience on anybody, and I wouldn't want that experience, but at the same time, having lived it, I wouldn't trade it away because it's all part of becoming, really, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
God, that's beautiful, George. A way of being okay in the world, even when the world isn't okay. I mean, I don't want to distract you any further, but let's come back to that, because I think if there's anything that we could all learn from your story is how do you do that? Because
right.
I think,
well, the white buffalo cap helps. So
okay, let's go back. All right, let's go back to the white buffalo cap.
So fast forward, we're now done with 1984 for the moment, and up to 94. Right, this is when Miracle is born, and I finally talked my friends into taking me. So we drive to Janesville, and we get there, and my friend and I was pretty frail. I mean, it's I don't know, maybe I weighed 134 or something pounds at that time. I'm 5'8", so I wasn't totally emaciated yet, but I was definitely very thin and no muscle tone because I just was doing so little. And and they're like, do you want us to help? There's a little tiny hill. Wisconsin's not a super hilly place, up to the pasture. And they're like, do you want us to help you? And I'm like, no, I have to do it on my own. And I walked for a little bit, and then I just couldn't walk anymore. So I crawled on my hands and knees. There's like families there, and they're like, children are being guided away from the crazy man while you're crawling towards the pasture. But I get to the fence line, and I just get very quiet in myself, the meditation techniques, and just really kind of get centered in my heart and try to connect with the heart of this white buffalo Miracle. And when I got really still and really connected, I heard, and I say here, I'm a sensate, so I feel things in my body, and there's not really very good language for that. But I heard, all is as it should be, right? And I was like, oh, right. All is as it should be. I've been judging my experience. I've been like so angry about this process when this is maybe coming to teach me something. Like everything is as it should be, sort of Hildegard of Pigeon, right? Like all is well, and all manner of things are well. But it was a message that came into my heart, and a knowing that came to me. And it changed everything. I mean, again, it was like, okay, now I can be okay with the world not being okay, right? I I didn't get better. I was still racked with pain every day. I was still exhausted. But what I realized is I could start focusing, like if I could just accept that this is where it was, this is my life right now. I'm not gonna get that PhD. I'm not gonna have a great day, but I'm gonna have moments in the day. And so I started focusing on what I could do. Like, I would get up in the morning, and if I had enough energy, I'd wash 10 dishes from dinner the night before. And then I'd go, take some opium, sleep for a while, and then get up and wash 10 more dishes. And by the time my roommates got home, all the dishes were done, right? So now I'm contributing a little bit, and that feels good. And yeah, and so I started to at least have that, from Miracle. Yeah. And then I got lucky in Madison, Wisconsin. There's a naturopathic pharmacy and allopathic pharmacy that are one's on one floor and the other's on the other. And so when I was going to pick up some meds, the pharmacist was like, we've tried everything. You're still, struggling. Why don't I call upstairs and see if they can offer some advice? And so the pharmacist called the naturopathic pharmacist and said, this is what's been going on with this guy. He's tried all these different things, and he's wasting away. And the pharmacist's like, well, tell him to try glutamine. Tell him to try to add glutamine to his diet. So I bought some glutamine, and within a week, I had a semi-solid bowel movement, right? And it was like that was a miracle. This was months after Miracle of the Buffalo Calf, but I'm like running through my house. I shit solid. Like all my roommates are celebrating with me because it was like such a big deal. And things didn't just get better like immediately, but it was a sign of improvement. And some energy comes when you start absorbing nutrients, right? So I didn't gain weight overnight, and I didn't stop having diarrhea overnight, but I did start having less frequent bowel movements, and started gaining a little bit of weight. But I was still a person with AIDS, and there was no real medical regimens that work. So at some point, my doctor's like, this is around 96 or so. My doctor's like, George, I think you should get your affairs in order. I'm like, what does that mean, Frank? And Frank Graziato, definitely a hero of mine. And he said, well, 6 to 12 weeks, right? So being somebody that just is like stubborn and not, maybe it's a stage of grief, just in denial. I'm like, okay, if I have 12 weeks, then I'm going to go for something, right? I'm going to just go for something. So I had, over the week just prior to that, had stumbled into some store that sold all this Course in Miracles stuff. And I had started reading the Course in Miracles, and I saw an ad in a magazine for this retreat center that was in Wisconsin, not far from where I was, maybe 2 hours away from where I was living, Kiel, Wisconsin, called Pathways of Light. They're all online now. It's a very different organization, but they used to be in person. And it was like, become a ordained minister in 90 days, right? And so I'm like, well, if I have 12 weeks left, I might as well do something with it. So I signed up for that program. I sold my shares in the house that I owned with a couple of other people in Madison, and used that money to pay for this 90-day retreat, and went there. And I was convinced that the Course in Miracles was going to save me. And so I had so many pages I was going to read every day. And then we had these classes with meditation and guided visualizations and all this stuff. And this is going to save me. And while I'm at the retreat center, we would finish class and I would grab my book and go someplace to read because I had to get my pages done so that I could live, right? and I'm there's this floating screen house on a little pond, and I'm sitting behind. There's like a little area, a little deck maybe behind the floating screen house, sitting there reading my Course in Miracles, like getting my lines done. And this dragonfly comes and lands on the book and looks up at me and then looks away and then looks up, and I swish it away. I'm trying to read, got to get my pages done. And I just keep reading, and it comes back, does it again. And I'm like really getting kind of annoyed because I have a certain number of pages I have to read. And I swish it away again. It comes back a third time, and I'm just like, what? And I look up, and the pond is just a ripple from the breeze, right? And the sun is setting. So it's literally like a pile of gold is sitting right in front of me. So gorgeous. And again, I was like, oh, right. I have this moment to live. I might not have another moment. Like reading this book, maybe it's helpful, but being present to the moment is much more helpful. So that was a huge, that was another huge lesson that just, so the dragonfly has become a huge symbol for me, right? Of just coming present, of just transforming out of like focusing on suffering or even focusing on, I don't know, joy, just being present, right? Just deeply and profoundly present to what is right before you. That's where the gold lies. So that was another transformational moment. I don't know how I kept going in that time. I did end up shortly thereafter in hospitalized, and there was a couple of other hospitalizations in there too that I won't go into, but I ended up hospitalized, and this was kind of my second hospitalization with pneumocystis pneumonia, which is one of the things that killed a lot of people with HIV. And during that hospitalization, taking like all is as it should be and be present to the moment, I just went into the deepest meditation of my life. And I refused to allow visitors for more than an hour a day. I would only allow them to do one blood draw a day because I wanted all my time to be spent in meditation so that I could understand what my illness was trying to teach me. And yeah, how am I to be okay with being racked with pain, losing all this weight, not being able to breathe, literally drowning inside my lungs because pneumocystis just multiplies in your lungs. It's a little critter, right, that creates its own environment in your lungs and multiplies until you basically drown, with pneumonia. You had a question.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really having a hard time understanding where this, and it's because it's my background, trying to where this faith comes from, like why you think it's going to work out, or why you think, I mean, it's this kind of stuff I say intellectually. Like every conflict has something to teach us. The only way out is through. It's all an invitation to getting deeper, but right. You're literally precisely dying of complications from AIDS.
Yeah.
You still think the moment has something to teach you, and you're not just engaged in self-pity? Like, how's that happening?
Well, it's not, because all is as it should be. That wasn't something that I read in a book. That was something that was a realization that came inside of my heart and was permeated my body. So once you know that all is as it should be, if you really feel that and believe that with every like molecule of your being, then it's all about, so this is either I'm learning something or I'm going to teach something. My mom was, of course, freaking out. We had long ago repaired our relationship, and she's like going to the nuns to have them pray for me, and she's freaking out. And I'm like, Mom, look, if my death is what teaches somebody else to love deeply, then so be it. I can't control how long this embodiment experience is going to go on. All I can do is be present to it. And so the suffering, when you stop judging it, right, you're just experiencing pain.
Yeah.
And the suffering goes away.
Yeah.
And it's hard. And it's not something, it's not, again, not something I would say I want or that I want somebody else to have. But I also say, okay, but this pain and learning to walk in it is a teacher for me. And sometimes it's a teacher for others too. But so I was still learning. I mean, maybe I was dying, right? But I was still learning. I'm still embodied. I'm still part of this embodied experience. And it just happened to include a lot of pain, but very little suffering, because I had stepped out of that judgment after that experience with the white buffalo calf. One of my friends right now, from another friend from Cornell, who's a brilliant astrologist, is going through a really tough health situation. And she was on Facebook saying something about pain or needing strength. And I shared, she knew me going through all this stuff. And I said, during the years that, the dance macabre was circling me, it wasn't strength. It was surrender, right? It was just surrender to knowing that everything was as it should be. And if what should be is me leaving this body, then doing that in peace is preferable to me, right? But I wasn't done yet. So when I'm in the hospital and I'm praying, I'm still in the body and I'm still seeking to learn. And I just go deeper and deeper into meditation until suddenly I just feel this presence of all unconditional love, right? Just this amazing, loving presence approach me. I, of course, call that Christ because I was raised Catholic, but I'm clear that presence can be called by any name. Yeah. That means unconditional love, and it will come. And it just reviewed my life with me. I had the life review. It's like, here's the places where you are less than loving. Here's the places where you could have been more loving. And it was very gentle. It wasn't shaming or blaming. It was just helping me understand, like, if you're about love, then, there's places you can do a better job.
And that was the sole evaluative criteria, is moments that you were loving or not loving.
Yes. Yeah. Or moments where you missed the mark on being as loving as you could possibly be. Yeah. And at the end of that review, the presence said, and now you are healed. And so I come out of this intense meditation with this resounding, I am healed. I'm healed and I feel good. I can breathe, right? I come out and I'm supposed to have a lung biopsy that morning because they were trying to figure out, in addition to the pneumocystis pneumonia, there was some mass on my lungs that they couldn't tell from an X-ray what it was or what it was about. And so they come and they wheel me down to get the lung biopsy. On the way, there's this woman who shows up in my vision. It's very surreal to be in a hospital for a long time, by the way, to always be under artificial light. Like, it becomes this very surreal state. Not to mention, I just come out of this deep meditation with this healing experience. But this woman's face shows up and I'm like, oh, I did some past life regression work with her, I facilitated it for her. And she says, George, what are you doing here? I'm like, well, I was really sick and dying and now I'm healed. And she's like, oh, okay. And I keep being wheeled down, and then I get to the doctor and he says this same thing almost. He's like, you look really healthy for a guy that needs a lung biopsy. Before I open you up, I'd really love to just run you through the CAT scan and see what's going on, because, you just don't look like somebody that needs a lung biopsy. And I'm like, okay, I was healed this morning. And he's like, oh, okay. and I'm like, it's fine.
Clash of the worlds. It's like, which on-duty nurse healed you?
Right, exactly. Yeah. So they run me through the CAT scan, and then he's like, I don't know what this is in your X-ray, but it's gone. As far as I'm concerned, you can be released from the hospital. And I was released the next day. Yeah. Oh, it's so hard because there's so much like of the story that I've left out, but in my denial, I had secured an apartment in San Francisco while I was
While you're in
home
the hospital?
visit for the summer. But while I was in the hospital, I was arranging to move there, from my hospital that I was making calls to set up movers and things when I wasn't in meditation and wasn't coughing up blood. Denial is such a powerful psychological tool. I think it's spiritual faith, but there's also psychological denial that helped me in those moments. So anyway, I leave the hospital, my things are packed within days. I think I had a big yard sale or something, and then within 2 weeks, I was on my way to San Francisco after this hospitalization. But on the way, I stopped to do some past life regression work with a woman I had worked with spiritually, who is known as Aya. And during that work, I realized that I wasn't supposed to move to San Francisco, that I wasn't meant to live there. And I don't remember the details of that. I would have to pull out my journal because I journaled all that stuff. And so there would be more details there. But nevertheless, I go to San Francisco and my stuff arrives and it just fits into this apartment, which I rented sight unseen from a garden party in Syracuse, New York, where some people from San Francisco visiting were bemoaning the fact that they had to put their apartment back on the market because of the long lines of people and having to say no to like 1,499 people and only being able to say yes to one. And I'm like, well, I'll rent it and then you don't have to put it on the market. So I rented an apartment sight unseen. I moved there and my stuff just fits in perfectly. All the while I'm unpacking and placing my stuff, I'm like, I know I'm not meant to live there because I had this regression work that I did in between. And so I get all my stuff there and then I write a note to another friend of mine who's supposed to come and visit me, who had also been looking for a place in San Francisco, and just said, well, you can have everything here. You can just move into this apartment, just work it out with the landlords. I'm not meant to be here. And then I, gave a key to another friend of mine that lived across in the East Bay and just said, give this to Guy when he shows up. And if he doesn't want to live there, then just, take anything you want and give the rest to the poor. I don't need any of my things anymore. And I left that apartment with my car, like a box of pills, because at the time I took maybe 72 pills a day. A Course in Miracles, my Bible, and a suitcase full of clothes and my journals, and then my pictures and diplomas and all that stuff. And I just drove down Highway 1. And at this point, I'm doing the Ramana Maharshi self-inquiry chant, right? Mm-hmm. Who am I? Who am I? Who am I? Right? Beneath this, who am I? Beneath this, who am I? And just over and over and over. And I'm just sinking deeper and deeper into this chant. And then at some point, I just have the one taste, right? Like I just pull over to one of those pullouts on Highway 1 going down the coast. And
you're doing this while driving?
Yeah.
Jeez, man.
Not saying it was the brightest bulb in the back, but I was still a pretty ill person, right? Like I still had some diarrhea, I was still wasting away. Even though I had the healing experience, my lungs were clear. I was taking all these medications to stave off all these opportunistic infections, was not physically well. And, but I'm still, again, I'm still in my body. I still want to have the experience of being human and maybe transcend that experience at the same time. And so I pull over into this, rest area. And I don't know how long this experience of just being connected to everything and nothing, right? It's like, it's so hard to put into words that kind of one taste experience, but so it could have gone on for a half an hour or 30 seconds, right? It's timeless. And so I have this profound experience, and then I get to Big Sur, and I get a room in the campgrounds there. There's like a little hotel at the state campgrounds, and I get a fireplace room, and I burn all of my diplomas, all of my pictures. I'm like releasing personal identity and realizing I had held everybody in these little boxes of their personality, their personal identities, and that I was keeping them locked there for my own selfish purposes, really. Right. Like, and so I would burn a photograph of somebody and release, any expectations of them, any definition of them, and do that for myself as I burned my diplomas and my yearbooks and all of that stuff. And I just got clearer and clearer. It was, and this is part of the story that I told that intrigued you a bit, I think during the retreat, but I got so clear. And then the next morning when I woke up, I was just like, what now? Right. And actually, I should back up to that one taste experience, because when I came back, it was like, immediately it's like, what does this mean about me now? Right. Like immediately the ego wanted to come back in and I define and identify with this experience.
Am I enlightened now? Is that it? Right. Do I get to be an enlightened person?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Can I be a guru and make millions selling my joy internationally? And I just noticed that, and then I just started laughing, hysterically at my own hubris, so then I go and I do my burning ceremony, and the next day when I wake up, I hear, go to Encinitas and pick up David. I don't know where Encinitas is. I'd never been there. Who David is, I don't know how to find him, but I'm like, okay. So then I just start following the still clear voice of my soul. And I drive to Encinitas and I look around, and there's a Yogananda garden there. And so I'm like, oh, well, I'll just sit and meditate in the garden. And I'm sitting and meditating on a bench in the garden, and I hear a man saying, well, I don't know how I'll get there. I've just given up everything I own, which of course I had just done, right? And I don't tell him that. Like, I don't say, oh, I gave up everything too, because it wasn't about that kind of ego connection of we're the same. It was about, oh, I'm your ride. So I just approach this man and I say, are you David? And he says, yes. And I say, I'm your ride. Where would you like to go? And, he's a little bit taken aback, but he's like, well, I'm trying to get to Happy Valley. So, it's a ashram where they grow flowers to support Yogananda Self-Realization Institute. So I drive him to Happy Valley, and then I decided to spend a few days there, just in meditation and journaling. And, suddenly I'm in a group meditation and I hear, open your eyes. And I open my eyes and I see this kind of Marlboro looking man coming in the door. And I close my eyes, go back into meditation. And then when it breaks, like, offer the man a blessing. Okay. Walk up to the stranger and say, I have a blessing for you. Would you like to receive it? Yes. Put your hand on his heart. I'm like, oh man, this is where I get punched in the face, right? I'm like, may I put my hand on your heart? Sure. And then the words just pour through me to this man. I couldn't even tell you what I said to him, because it wasn't about me personally. I was just a vehicle for this to come through to this other person who was reduced to tears and had some sort of healing event with their childhood wounding. And then he ended up, I heard through the grapevine later, going back and letting go of all his stuff and living at the ashram for a while. But so things like that just sort of unfolded, right?
So is the idea, this is a teaching I got in my time in, traveling in India and whatnot, that like when you can clear all of the bullshit, then you can just be this channel and receive your like deepest inner wisdom. Is that?
Yeah. Well, you get to, yes. Well, and and I guess I would only take exception with the phrase your. I would just say, that wisdom works through you, right? And it's an impersonal. And so, yeah, I mean, I was still very ill. I was sort of surviving on this stuff called resource, which is like Ensure. I would drink like 3 of those a day. And, there was a lot of pain and there was a lot, to manage in terms of my physical body. But what I knew to be true was that I would always have enough energy to be of service to the moment, right? If I stay present to the moment, that I would have enough energy to be of service to the moment. And that it can take so many forms. And again, including the form of maybe somebody holding me while I die, because maybe that teaches them compassion. I didn't limit or define what that service would be. I just stayed present and allowed wisdom, love to work through me.
And because of this sensing you had of the truth that everything all is as it should be,
yeah,
even your own death did not trigger resistance or emotion. Like you could imagine that and be like, oh, that's just another way of service, just like doing the dishes or giving a guy a ride.
Most of the time, I won't say that I didn't step into fear ever, especially if I were attached to my personal self, that there was never any fear, because of course there was, but I had to surrender to the moment. If I came present to the moment and lived the truth of all is as it should be, then there was no fear of death or the dying process even, or the pain that may be associated with it. But it does require, or at least for me, it required surrendering an idea of who I was supposed to be or should be or even could be, and just being, it's sort of the master does nothing, yet nothing remains undone. That was like a mysterious cone to me from Taoism, until I realized it's because you're just being, you're just in being. And yes, of course, there are things happening that your physicality may facilitate, but it's not about the doing of them. It's about the being with them and being in general. So, a lot of opportunities came to extend healing to others, and I stayed alive, and eventually made my way back to Madison, Wisconsin, where my doctor once again told me to get my affairs in order. And that time, that was around 98. That time I did return to Syracuse to my family, because it did feel like my physical being was giving in. And I went back and struggled to find a doctor that would work with me, because there's like the medical field, right? Like, we know what's best for you. So there were meds available, by 96, but for those of us who had taken drugs one at a time or been through medical trials, we had multi-resistant virus. And so they weren't working well. And an experimental test came out testing for resistance. And so I'm really ill. I'm in Syracuse, New York, and I'm at the big HIV clinic, and I'm asking them to order this test for me. And they say, well, we don't know how to interpret the test. And I'm like, well, I've read all the studies, I'll bring them in. We can interpret it together. Right. But I couldn't order the test. Our medical system doesn't allow a person to just, order a blood test. You have to have a medical professional order it for you. And they wouldn't do it. And I was like, wow, so I asked the nurse when the doctor leaves, I'm like, is there another doctor in town that, sees people with HIV that you think might work with me? And she gave me the name of Dr. Mitchell Brody, who's just an amazing, brilliant man. Actually did his postdoc in infectious disease in Madison, Wisconsin. So we had that nice connection. But when I went to see him, he said, well, I've never ordered one of these before, but let's get it and we'll figure it out together. I'm like, that's right. That's exactly what I want to hear. And so we did, and I ended up right after that resistance testing, I ended up in another bout of pneumocystis and where I had a fever every day for 6 weeks, from anywhere from 101 to 105, mostly between 103 and 105. And for a sustained period, it was in that really high range. And every day my doctor would call me, and, I was in the hospital for a few days, and then they're like, there's nothing else we can do for you. So you can stay here or you can go home. So I just went home, and every day my doctor would call and say, how you doing? And I'd be like, not good, doc, and list my, everything that was happening in my body. And he'd say, well, maybe tomorrow will be better. Right. And then he would call me the next day. We'd just go through this. At one point, my mouth filled with thrush. And I'm like, doc, I can't even swallow. I got so much thrush. And he's like, do you have fluconazole? And of course, I had an arsenal of medications because of all the pills I took. And so he's like, take some fluconazole. And then I almost choked to death when the big chunks of plaque fell off the roof of my mouth and hit the back of my throat while I was passed out in a fever. And and I just really this really did seem like the end. So it really seemed like that 6 to 12 week thing this time was gonna be true. But I would say about 5.5 weeks in the middle of the night, my fever was spiking, and I had a come to Jesus talk with Jesus, right? Like, I'm like, look, I know I'm not supposed to take my life. I know I'm supposed to be seeking, always the truth, but I just can't do this anymore. Like, I either have to start getting better tomorrow or I have to end it. And the next day, my fever didn't pass 101. And within 3 days, I was sitting at the table eating. And within a little over a year, I returned to work. And my doctor put together a incredible 5-drug regimen. 3 drugs was the standard of care at that time. But he gave me everything that I had. If I didn't have total resistance to the med, almost, he put it in my regimen. So I took 5 HIV meds and slowly got better. I started taking human growth hormone to put weight back on my body. And that helped a ton. And so over the period of about 16 months between the last time I was fevered and I went back to work. And life's been good.
And since then, is that your last near-death experience? Is that...
Yeah, pretty much.
Like 15 more that we're going to get to.
There was one kind of scary. I have a genetic disorder that causes blood clotting. So I did end up with a clot from my ankle all the way up into my groin and my left leg, and then some scattershot pulmonary embolisms that happened after I went back to work. That was a scary moment, but it was brief.
Yeah, nothing.
Acute, intense pain, but brief. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Well, thank you for taking us on that journey, George. And I'd love to go back to something you said near the beginning when we were talking about that white buffalo calf.
Yeah.
But this sense, how did you put it?
Being okay even when the world is not okay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. How did that come about? And how can that come about for me and everybody else?
Well, I think it does go to cultivating a relationship with the present moment and a willingness to be of service to extending love in every moment, right? And that means different things at different times, so it's not, there's no formula, so sometimes you feed people who are hungry, and other times you teach people how to plant a garden, right? It's so being okay even when the world isn't okay comes to a profound relationship with yourself and with everything, seeing yourself as separate and not separate at the same time. I'm separate enough. I give this mantra to new human service workers, right? Self, other, self, other. This self that seems separate from all that is, even though quantum physics tells us that's not true. That's what we get. That's what we have agency over. That's what we get to decide. Do I want to be stuck in my past? Do I want to be tripping out on the future? Or do I want to be with what is before me as fully as I possibly can, still being human and subject to distraction, as fully as I possibly can? And can I respect that everybody else is making different choices than I am? And sometimes that creates chaos in the world, right? Especially for people who are really disconnected from their hearts. They try to fill it up with things, and that creates havoc on the planet. There's so much that I could just not be okay with, but that's my personal self and judgment of the experience of what's going on. But if I come to the present moment and step outside of that personal identity and personal preferences and just say, how can I be of service to this moment? Well, then I can be okay. I don't know how to say it any other way. Along the journey, I realized that I've come to this planet to teach what I call detached commitment, right? Which is really committing to living fully your values, expressing them in your way of life, and being detached from the outcome. And so that's something that I invoke to be okay with when the world's not okay around me.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean isolating oneself or just sitting in silence and ignoring what's going on. There's actually a lot of action that comes out of that. It's just action without judgment.
Right. And it's being, it's being in relationship with the present moment in your service to it, so that whatever action is taken is in alignment with your purpose, your soul's expression here, and it doesn't have to be anybody else's. So you don't have to argue with people about, their choices. You just have to be clear and conscientious, in your own being, and staying present, or coming back to the presence whenever you notice that you've drifted away, which happens again and again and again every day. Yeah. One of the books that I read during my illness, one of her prayers was, let every beat of my heart bring me closer to you. So for a long time, every day, I would journal, let my will be thy will, leading up to that who am I experience, and realizing that it is all we are. It isn't about some will outside of my own. It is about surrendering a personal will to a service of the highest and best for all that is. And just, again, doing that over and over and over.
Thanks, George.
Yeah.
It's really hard to grasp, verbally, intellectually, these ideas.
Yeah.
I think you've really demonstrated how they can be experienced and felt, and indicated one way of preparation or of approaching them.
Yeah. I think it is, when you find yourself feeling really disconnected from whatever it is that other people, whatever it is that where you sense connection, it's to lean into that and really try to allow that experience to teach you where connection lies, right? Because then it'll bring you back to the moment. That's a practice, that I guess unofficially I kept going back to, is and when you notice yourself judging others, you're probably judging yourself, right? Because we project all the time onto others. And so if you find yourself in judgment, it's like, oh, notice you're in judgment, and then see if you can come present to just what's before you in this moment. Is there a way for you to be of service to the moment? In whatever you believe, again, you can say absolute love, you can say absolute truth, you can name a God, if you have a God that you believe in, to be of service to that God, to be in service to truth, to be in service to love, to be in service to wisdom. But come back to, how do I bring that connection to the present moment, and be in service of something greater than seemingly separate self.
How can I be of service to this moment?
Yeah. And whatever your idea of something greater greater than yourself, and it can be an abstract idea, like absolute truth. Like, I don't even know what that means, but if I make that my thing, it will inform a way of being with the moment that creates good for something, including myself, but greater than myself.
Hmm.
So I do encourage people to choose a God, even though, I don't care what God that is. It can be abstract concepts.
How is that helpful? How is it helpful to have a word or a specific God type noun in there?
Because the idea, so I used to call it the Holy Spirit, right, in my Catholic days. And then I went to my highest self during my Course in Miracle days. And now I say my human soul because I'm more Jungian now. And it occurred to me only recently that they're all HSs. So in my journal, it looks very the same. And it is the same, because what it is to acknowledge that there is something more than the limited self. Otherwise, if I'm in service to the moment from the standpoint of limited self, I'm probably going to be in service to my ego. And I'm not a person that pathologizes the ego any longer. I think healthy egos are really important. We have inflated egos all over the place, and they're somewhat dangerous. But healthy egos are the vehicles through which we experience consciousness on this planet and come into relationship with one another. So they're really important. But if I'm just in service to the moment as my limited self, then I'm probably going to be self-serving. And the idea is that although I have this experience of separation, and I'm meant to have this experience of separation in this human form, I'm in awareness of my connection to all that is. I'm in awareness of the truth that quantum physics teaches us, right? That when you and I were together, we exchanged atoms. And now I am part of you and you are part of me. And I'm part of the chair you're sitting in probably too, because some of my atoms have left you and have joined the chair. And, this thing that we sit on a chair and we know that there's more space in the chair than there is anything solid. We have all this faith in the, so it's just to we have to come into an awareness, an embodied awareness of our connection to everything when we're in service to a moment, in order for the greatest and best good for all that is to occur. That's why I say it doesn't, absolute truth, absolute love, it doesn't have to be an anthropomorphized figure. It doesn't have to become something that's actually outside of myself. It can be inclusive of myself, but hopefully it's not limited to myself, because that's when I think we often fall into ego inflation and personal aggrandizement, and it's me trying to define my one taste experience in a way that I make it part of my identity, so other people see me in some way rather than just being with it and using it to inform my way of being.
Yeah. It's such a pleasure for me to talk to you and to hear you tell your stories, that I was just not very moved to ask too many questions during this time. Just like I've had these experiences, like these brief glimpses of what you're talking about, but I really get this sense that you're just living there. You're like living in this foreign land of like a deep felt understanding of the permeability of the self.
Yeah.
And the lack of these like hard distinctions between self and other, that even from my brief visits there, I've learned so much from, and they've just totally shaped me.
Yeah, that's all I have too, are brief visits, but I do draw on them to help inform, and return to those places, right? Those brief visits are that's so that you can embody, and it's not just some abstract intellectual concept, right? It's not some a priori idea from reading the Tao Te Ching. It's having those glimpses that help us embody it. But we have to come back. I mean, if we stay in that, Ramana Maharshi is a great example, right? I love him. There's a picture of him over on my desk when I look over there. He stayed in that place. He also stayed at the foot of the mountain, and people fed him. And he had great impact, and his teaching was beautiful. And, I wouldn't have probably had the experience I had if he didn't embody that experience for his entire lifespan. But not all of us are meant to live at the foot of the mountain. So I think what you bring your brief experiences to the work that you do, and it informs your way of being, just like I do.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much, George. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you.
If you like this episode, you can join the 10,000 Heroes Club, our own community of purpose, by clicking the link below this video. You'll never miss an episode. You'll have opportunities to nominate the people I interview and the questions I explore. But perhaps most importantly, you'll have an opportunity to share your dreams and your needs in a safe space of mutual intention and trust.